I was sitting at the piano one night practicing, and my dad came in and interrupted me. And he would do that, and it always annoyed me. And I said to him, "What do you want now?" And he said, "I have this Henkin girl on the phone, and I told her you were going to talk to her. Now, are you going to talk to her, or are you going to embarrass me?" So I get up from the piano, and I'm absolutely furious at my dad. And I took the phone from him, and I said, "Don't ever do this to me again." And into the phone, I said, "Hello, Janice." And there's a long silence followed by, "My name is Jackie." And the upshot was she agreed to go to a date. She agreed to go with me on a date that Saturday night. So we went out to a nice restaurant, and then we went to see, are you ready? The Beatles and Yellow Submarine. I rang the bell, and the door opened, and I looked up the stairs, and at the top of the stairs, there was this vision of beauty in a yellow dress, and her hair was then down to her shoulders. And my first thought that went through my head is that has got to be her sister, because no blind date ever looked that good. But it was her. And we got in the car and we started driving and we started talking about music. And I said to her, "What kind of music do you like?" And she said, "Mozart and Beethoven and so forth." I said, we're tuning in here. I said, "What in particular?" "Mozart piano concertos." We have taste. "Which are your favorites?" The 21st, the 20th, the 23rd. "And how about Beethoven? Which is your favorite concerto?" "The fourth." I said, "Now, this is a person with real taste and discernment." I told her about my love of the Beatles and my fascination with their music. Very calmly, she said, "I have time." And that was so different from the girls I had met. This is someone you can talk to. And we had a grand piano. I played a few things for her, Beethoven, a little Mozart, and a little bit of Beatles. And then I said to her, "I want to play for you what I think is the single most beautiful love song that I've heard in our lifetime, written in our lifetime." And I played, I don't know if you can guess this, the Beatles, "Here, There, and Everywhere."
What does it sound like?
"Here, making each day of the year, changing my life with a wave of her hand." That's on Revolver. So when I was really getting into the Beatles, and you had asked me yesterday, how did I really start getting into the Beatles? And I mentioned, I'd been hearing their music and sort of grudgingly admitting this is not just, the usual crappy rock stuff that you hear. There's a lot going on here. And someone said to me one night, "You should listen to the Beatles, Eleanor Rigby." And I was in the studio, WAMF. I was doing my classical show, so I pulled out Eleanor Rigby and I put it on. And what do you hear when you hear Eleanor Rigby? It's not a rock song. It's a work of art. It's a string quartet. It's actually a double string quartet. And that incredible verse that Paul wrote, it's unimaginable. I think he was 20 years old when he wrote this. It's like a perfect portrait of loneliness, isolation. Allen Ginsberg, the poet, wrote to Paul and he said, "I want you to know this is a great poem." So when I listened to Eleanor Rigby, I became a convert. I've got to hear more of their music. So I bought the Revolver album, which had Eleanor Rigby on it, and I started playing it one night. And suddenly this song came on. And I stopped. I was working and listening to it. I stopped working and just listened. And it brought tears to my eyes. It was so beautiful. And I don't believe what I just heard. I've got to hear that again. And I put it on again. And then, of course, I got the sheet music and learned it on the piano. Give you a quick example. Eleanor Rigby, there's that very harsh string sound. because it's portraying a portrait of loneliness, and so the strings are very harsh sounding. And that sound was deliberately meant to imitate Bernard Herrmann's score for Psycho when she's in the shower and you hear this, yeah, 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 yeah. That they wanted to capture that same kind of harsh sound. Here I am back in my parents' home, and I had just played Here, There, and Everywhere on the piano for Jackie. And I looked up at her, and she didn't say a word. She didn't applaud. She didn't say a word. She just had a little smile on her face, a perfect little smile. And I think at that moment I said to myself, I'm going to marry her. She was the first girl who ever said to me, I love you. But my mother was someone people talked about that way. Everyone loved my mother. She had a gift of, and it's funny because in private she could be very cold and very judgmental, but in dealing with people she was warm and open, and you felt immediately that you liked her and that she liked you and that you could talk to each other. And she had that personality. I thank her. I think she gave me that. I think it's part of why my storytelling ability. But in dealing with someone one-on-one, she was always open and warm. And I learned that, I don't want to say as a skill, because skill kind of implies that it's something you're learning how to do. I think it came naturally to me just because of who my mother was. I tend to be, I'm not saying this in a self-promoting way, but in any group or organization I've been in, I've always been very well liked. I became a leader in the bar association, which I never planned on. It just, I kind of floated to the top. Everybody pushed me. They came to me in 2006 and begged me to take over the editorship of the Business Law Journal, which I've been doing for 20 years now. I was general counsel of the New York Bankers Association in the 90s. And I worked on, it was a job I loved, and I was perfect for it because it involved writing, a lot of writing. The bankers quickly picked up how well I wrote, as did everyone at the Fed when I was there. And I was writing speeches for the bankers. I was writing their testimony. And I also started a publication, New York State Banking Journal, which I completely wrote myself. And it was an update on everything that was happening in the courts and the regulatory world and so forth and so on. And I would distribute it to the bankers. Anyway, so I've always had the ability to fit in and to be well liked. And I know how to talk to people. And one thing I learned, which was one of my mother's things that she used to say to me, was you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And it was something I always thought about. Any organization, there's always somebody you don't like or who doesn't like you. That's life. And for a period of time at Macquarie, where I work now, I had a woman boss who I don't think liked me. She was very different from me. She was very procedural and process oriented, and she was not a creative thinker at all. And, if she had thought about it right, we could have complimented each other well. But I think she kind of resented me in a way. And so I would go out of my way to say nice things about her to third parties. I'd say, Kathy is really great. She really knows how to get this done, that she has this organized. I would do everything. And it's just, you disarm people when you're nice to them. And it worked so much better than being hostile and confrontational. And I'm not a confrontational type. I don't think I would have made a good litigator because I'm not, even though I'm articulate, I like to argue, but I'm not, I'm not combative. I'm not. To me, it's not about winning and losing. It's about getting to a good result, solving a problem. And this is 1974, and I just started working at the Federal Reserve. And I was thrown headlong into this crisis with the Franklin National Bank. I was secretary to the senior officers who were working on finding a solution. Again, that they had picked up right away on my writing ability. I was kind of secretary of every major task force. My boss was this extremely bright younger man. He was in his 30s then, who was a rising star in the Federal Reserve System. And he was a Harvard lawyer by background. Although he was not practicing law, he was running our credit and discount area of the Fed. 1974, Jackie was sworn in as a lawyer, and my dad and I went to the swearing-in ceremony. And as we're walking away, my dad says to me, "Now that you have a good job at the Fed and you're working there, why don't you go to law school at night?" And I said to him, "Law school at night? Are you crazy? I'm just going to go." He was a self-made man. I came to really admire him in later years and to really understand what he went through. And then I found out the Fed had a program where if you took an approved course of study at night, they would pay your tuition. I think I mentioned I had a 753 on the law boards, and I didn't get into Stanford. Well, 4 years had passed at this point, and the law boards expire after a certain period of time. So I had to take them over. And I said, well, there's no way I'm ever going to get a 753 again. And I came home, and Jackie said, "How did you do?" And I said, "There's no way I got a 753. You asked me what the law boards what they're about. It's a mix of things, but a large part of it is reading fact patterns, stories, and then answering questions about them. And you can't look back at them. And just kind of, you have to absorb what is important. Spotting an issue, that's what a good lawyer does. This is what the legal issue is. Here's the possible solution to the issue. So it's a mix of stuff, but it kind of tests. The main thing it tests, I think, is the ability to reason. They're not testing you on knowledge of the law, obviously, or anything in specific, no. So I took the boards, I came home, and I said to Jackie, she said, "How'd you do?" I said, "Well, I certainly didn't get a 753 this time. No way." So a month or so later, go to the mailbox, and there's the envelope from the ETS, and oh boy, this is my law board scores. Peel open the envelope, and I see 753, 800. And so I said to Jackie, "Look at this. I got exactly the same score again, 753 out of 800. And she looked at it and she said, "Dummy, that's not what it says. It says your first test was 753, your second test was 800. And so there was a front page story about Ben Glass's son David got 800 on the law boards. Fordham was by far the best. So I applied to Fordham. I didn't apply anywhere else. I knew I was going to get in. I started Fordham Law School in the fall of '75. And I remember about 2 weeks in, my dad called me, and he was kind of very anxious, "How's it going?" Because this was his dream, that I'd become a lawyer. And I said to him, "You want to know something? I am eating this up. This is what I was cut out to do. This is me. This is what I do. This is what I'm good at." And I was working at the Fed. I was promoted 3 times in 3 years. I wound up head of the staff that I had originally joined. The first thing I did was hire a woman. We had at that point 8 analysts and 6 girls who did the typing. And we were, at that time, I don't know if you remember this, New York City and New York State were both deep in financial crises. We couldn't help directly, but we were doing a lot of the background analysis, and we would meet with city officials. I met with the governor, Governor Carey. I met with the mayor. I met with a lot of, it's kind of not what you expect from the Fed, but the interesting thing is that the city had approached us about possibly getting an emergency loan from the Fed. It has to be approved by 5 of the 7 governors sitting on the board, so it has to be a supermajority, and it has to be fully collateralized. So, we talked to New York City, the joke was we're going to put a rope around Central Park, take that as collateral, And one day Chet came to me and he said, You know what we need you to do, Dave, because you're the writer around here. We want you to write a complete history of the Fed's involvement with this. I wound up writing, I think it was 150 pages when I was finished. I did so much writing there. I wrote, every senior officer wanted me to write their speeches. So I spent a lot of time just writing speeches. Same thing with the New York Bankers Association. The bankers wanted me to write their speeches. In junior high school, I remember specifically my first teacher in 7th grade was the one who really kept telling me, you are really a good writer, and you really know how to write, and you really should, keep doing it and keep developing it. I had encouragement. I had backing from, I was put into a creative writing class in high school, and I was the star of the class, very early on. I was the one everybody looked to and talked about, and Mrs. Russ, the teacher, sort of became my cheerleader when I was applying to college. I'd go to her and I'd say, I told her about applying to Amherst. There was one other college I applied to, which was Union College. And the reason I applied there was that we had relatives who had gone there. So I thought I would get in. That would be my safe school. And I got turned down by them pretty fast. So I figured, well, I didn't get into Union College. I'm not going to get to Amherst, So I'll go to Queens College with my friends. No big deal. But, of course, I did because of Dean Wilson. And, so I was told from the time I was quite young that I know how to write well. And, I'd submit papers and it would come back and the teacher's comment would be very well written. My English teacher, senior year in high school, I submitted a paper and he wrote back, he gave me an A+, and he just had 2 words at the top, superior work. So I knew I know how to write. So I hit Amherst, and of course we had English 1, and you had to write essays, 3 essays a week on top of everything else we were doing. I think it helped me in a very significant way in my later career as a lawyer, because I think the problem I had was that if I was interested in something, then I wrote well about it. If I was not interested, I really didn't. And some of the essays they gave us to write were, God, what do I have to write about this for? It's stupid, And what I learned was you have to, you don't always get to focus on what interests you. And certainly not as a lawyer. A client has a problem. The client is the issue, not you. It's not what you're interested in, it's what the client needs. And so you have to marshal your ability to write clearly and persuasively and apply it to this specific situation. And I think English 1 helped with that. The way you make it better is by saying, okay, let's focus. What is the mission of this organization? What is it supposed to achieve? How this particular thing that it's doing, how does that further its mission? And if it doesn't further the mission, why are we doing it? And that's the way you do it. And if there are people who are not producing, okay, you get rid of them. But you don't just come in the way. You're asking, is there a place for liberal education? I believe there is. But I don't believe it's right for everybody. And I think there are people who would be better served in more of a vocational kind of education. The last thing I would ever want is a collectivist kind of society which says, we're assigning you to this and we're assigning you to that. I believe in freedom and I believe in individuality and I believe in free markets and the right of every person to better his or her own lot, as long as they're doing it within the law. So I would not want to see that kind of thing mandated. So there was a major piece of legislation, the Interstate Branching and Banking Act, and I was very much involved in writing that. And each state had the option to write an opt-in law so that they could become opt into that. I was with the New York Bankers Association. Yeah, I was the general counsel. We basically represented the collective interests of the banks in New York State. And I would talk to them. I talk to bankers all the time. Most bankers are small businesses. Most of the people I dealt with had small businesses upstate. They were banks that employed 20 or 30 people, in the local community. And their interests were very different from Citibank or Chase. And part of I think the reason I was good at it was that I was skilled at building coalitions. I would talk to one side, I would talk to the other side. They don't want this, they do want this. Well, how about we make a little compromise and kind of do it this way? And I would incorporate into the law. I drafted the law. I spent hours and hours on the phone talking to people. I talked to bankers in other states. Yeah, but also for New York State law, because eventually New York State had to pass what was called an opt-in law so that the state banks could begin to participate in this. And so we were working on an opt-in law for New York State. Also, because the law was federal, and because of the U.S.'s peculiar federal-state dual banking system, where banks can be chartered either by the federal government or by the state, it's never entirely clear, if you pass a federal law, that state banks will have the full authority. So having the state affirmatively opt in was a way of promoting that. So I was writing that law, and I was working on the federal legislation a little bit with the American Bankers Association. I would talk to a guy there. I would give them ideas, and so the Democrats are holding a big fundraiser in New York. So we took a table, and the featured speaker, of course, was going to be Bill Clinton, the president. So we heard Bill Clinton speak, and at the end, he comes down the line and he's shaking hands. He comes up to me and I shake his hand and I said, "Mr. President, I'm David Glass and I'm General Counsel of the New York Bankers Association." And his face lights up and immediately he says to me, "Boy, Dave, that was a really important piece of legislation we just got done. So Dave, thank you for the work you did on it." He had that ability to connect with you, unlike his wife. 3 years later, I was at a New York bankers thing in Washington and Hillary came. We had at the table 4 bank presidents, myself and Chuck Schumer. During that 2 hours, I would say 95% of the words came out of one mouth, and it wasn't mine. This was a guy he talked nonstop, and he had an idea, he had a solution for everything. He has this piece of legislation and that one, and this is going to do this, and this is going to do that, and all these things that he put out you never heard of again. I gave him credit for one thing once. When I was with the New York bankers, there's a law called the Community Reinvestment Act, which requires banks to reinvest in the communities where they derive their deposits. And it's mainly aimed, obviously, at low and middle income communities. So, providing mortgages, providing small business loans. And you get judged on that. You get examined for your compliance with community reinvestment. And if you're not at least satisfactory, it means that you won't be able to open new branches or have a merger or anything. So that's the incentive. So banks actually compete with each other very vigorously to get what are, CRA loans. Chuck said to me, I was in a meeting with him and a couple of his aides and some other people, and he said to me, I know the banks need these kind of loans, and it doesn't make sense to me. Why are the banks? The issue was these people were getting their loans like through loan brokers and non-bank lenders, which charge points and fees, and they're more expensive. And why aren't the banks making more of these loans? I know the banks need these loans. It doesn't make sense to me. And so he said he had his staff look into it, and it turns out that in the black community, a lot of things focus around the church. And so what they started doing in that district was the bank started setting up, mortgage information centers outside the churches. People come out of church. If you're interested in buying a house, if you're interested in a mortgage, take our brochure and give us a ring. And that the percentage of people who are getting mortgages from banks went up significantly. So to me, that's an example of how you use common sense. Instead of throwing bricks at somebody and saying they're discriminating or they're doing this, find a way to solve the problem. Find a way that makes sense. And, that was always my approach to things. I'm registered as a Democrat nominally, but frankly, I have voted Republican for president a number of times. when I thought the Republican was the better candidate. So here I am with the Bankers Association in the 90s. I loved the work I was doing. It was perfect for me. I was writing constantly. Giving, I was conducting seminars. I was giving speeches. I was writing speeches for bankers. The president of Chase Manhattan Bank at the time was a wonderful man, Ed Miller, and he eventually became head of chemical, and chemical merged with Chase. So, do I want to do this the rest of my career? No, I want to get back into practicing law. I want to represent banks, make things happen. And so one day I had lunch with an old friend who had moved from Rogers and Wells to Skadden Arps. And as we're chatting, he said, I think my old law firm is looking for someone like you, Rogers and Wells. And can I give them your resume? And I said, yeah, sure, why not? That afternoon, the phone rang. Hi, Dave, this is Peter Williams of Rogers and Wells. We want to talk to you. I said, wonderful, when? He said, how about like right now? They set me up with interviews with all the members of the management committee, and within a week I had an offer to be a lawyer specializing in bank regulation. And it was strange. I was rehabbing my knee, and at the same time I was getting paid by two employers because the Bankers Association still owed me money. And the Rogers and Wells had started paying me, and I wasn't doing any work. I was just rehabbing my knees. So the Rogers in Rogers and Wells was Bill Rogers, the Secretary of State under Nixon, Attorney General under Eisenhower, one of the best people I ever knew. And Jackie was working for the courts, and she was one of the first women they had ever hired. And there was a partner there who hit on her. There was a partner who kept saying to her, what do you want to be, a woman or a lawyer? You can't be both. This was 1972 we're talking about. So she went back to the courts, and that was where Jackie spent the rest of her career. So writing opinions for judges was perfect for her. So here I am at Rogers and Wells, and I had been, what they told me when I came in was they would look at me. I was coming in as counsel, which meant I functioned like a partner. I ran my own practice, but I was getting paid a salary. My practice very quickly became representing foreign banks primarily that wanted to open offices in the U.S. So I filed branch applications, representative office applications. The guy who ran the branch was taking bribes to give loans, and so the U.S. attorney was prosecuting him for fraud. Of course, the Federal Reserve was, the bank's now going to get the death penalty, which meant they get it shut down and get out of the U.S. They called me and said, we need you to handle the banking side. Sure. Good. I went in and sat down with the Fed, and they bent my ear about how bad these people were. And I said to them, let's focus on a solution here. And here's what I'm proposing. We're going to pay a fine. I proposed a number which was less than I'm sure they were thinking of. I said, I understand you guys are going to assess a fine. That's, there's no way around that, and we understand that. We're going to pay a fine. We're going to shut down the branch. We're going to get out of the U.S. completely. All we ask in return is that you give us the opportunity to reapply, after 3 years, to reopen. And I got them to agree to that. And that's what I was good at. I was good in negotiating. You go in and you tell them right away, we're wrong, we were bad, we know it, we know we have to pay the price, but let's come up with a sensible way to do this, and not just kill everybody off. I represented foreign banks and all kinds of things, and so one day, I would say this was the single most important day in my career, and my phone rings. And he said to me, you ever heard of this Australian bank, Macquarie? I said, yeah, I've heard of them. I don't know a lot about their business, but I had heard of them. I'd represented National Australia. I represented Westpac for a period of time. I knew the Australian banks in general. And he said, well, they're looking for regulatory advice. You want to meet them? I said, sure. And they walked into my office, couple of people from Macquarie. I'd never met them before. And this lovely, lovely man, one of the best people I've ever dealt with, he sat down and he said to me, we are floundering. We just cannot figure out how to do what we want to do in the U.S. And it turned out Macquarie had a lot of different businesses in the U.S., commodity trading businesses, among others. They were big in trading commodities in Australia. And Macquarie was a bank in Australia, but banks in Australia had authority to do a lot more things than banks in the U.S. could do, including trading commodities, which the U.S. bank cannot do. There was more of a hedging business. And of course, you have a small company that isn't well capitalized, you can't, the market isn't going to trade with you. So Macquarie Bank had guaranteed the obligations of all these little companies that were its subsidiaries. Macquarie Bank had an A rating, and so the market. Macquarie started with 3 people in a trading room in 1969. And we grew through actually 5 separate businesses, each of which kind of grew on its own, but under one umbrella. I looked at what they were doing in the U.S., and I knew they could not open a branch in the U.S., Macquarie Bank, because then they would not be able to do all these things. When a foreign bank opens a branch in the U.S., it comes under the U.S. Bank Holding Company Act, which basically says you can only do banking and certain other financial things. You can't do any kind of commerce or physical trading. So I said to them, and it just off the top of my head, and the funny thing was I had given, I would say about 10 years earlier, when I was in law practice, I had held a seminar in New York for foreign banks. And in the seminar I talked about, here are the different ways you can open up in the U.S. And one way was what was called a representative office. And a representative office at that time basically was nothing. I used to joke it was a desk and a chair and a telephone and a Rolodex, and that was what it was. And that really was all it was. The foreign bank sends somebody over. His or her job is to make contacts with U.S. companies and so forth and say, here's what my bank can do for you. And if they actually want to do business, then they have to get in touch with someone offshore, because the representative can't legally do anything other than introduce them. So I said, well, off the top of my head, I said, how about a representative office? And they said, oh, no, we've been told that won't work. And they handed me a memo from another law firm, a well-respected law firm, but not one I would think of for banking law. And it basically said, well, representative offices can only do limited things. You can't really do it this way. And they had created a jerry-rigged structure for doing these trades, which I was very alarmed when I saw it. The Fed is not going to be happy with this if they see it. So I looked at the memo this law firm wrote, and I said to Stephen Lyons, this lovely man I just met, I said to him, I'm not convinced this doesn't work, but you would need to give me a chance to talk to the regulators. Are you willing to give me a chance? I will talk to New York State Banking Department and the Fed. I have an idea on why this might work. And he said yes. And that was how it started. I described my theory on why this worked. And she said, well, it sounds interesting. Give me a memo of law and we'll give you an answer. I said, fine. And I'm working on the memo of law, and Stephen calls me, and he said, our global head of risk management is going to be in New York, and he wants to meet you because he thinks you're going to blow us up. And this crazy idea that you have is going to get us into all sorts of trouble in the U.S. And he said, you're going to have to convince him, number one, that you're not going to blow us up, and number two, that this actually works. They were terrified of the whole U.S. regulatory system. I can understand why, because I've worked in the regulatory system. The Fed can do incredible damage to you if you're a bad person. The image was always the Federal Reserve is just going to come in and shut us down. And I tell people in Sydney, I tell them to this day, it doesn't work that way. They can't just come in and shut us down. It doesn't work that way. We would have to do something really bad before that could happen. If they say no, full stop. I said, and then the only thing you've lost is the money you've paid. If they say yes, we still have to make a full application to them and to the Federal Reserve. And you're asking me, how do I come to that conclusion after all my years of experience? Well, I think it started that, I worked at the Federal Reserve. I was in the credit and discount side, and then when I got my law degree, I moved into the legal side. And so I understood how they think about things. No regulation ever fits exactly what your client's situation is. And so you ask yourself, what are they really concerned about? What are they afraid of? What are they worried about? Why is the regulation there? Regulation's there because there's a law. They don't just write regulations out of clear blue sky. There's a law that tells them to write a regulation. So what does the law say? What does the regulation say? What was Congress worried about? Are they afraid of a foreign bank coming in? They're afraid of a foreign bank coming in and laundering money. I was telling you earlier on, the first time Stephen Lyons said to me, the first time we met you, we liked you. And I said, that's really nice to hear, but tell me why. And he said, we were going around to these hotshot Wall Street law firms, and at every one of them, they put you in a room, and these hotshot guys come in their three-piece suits, and they tell you how great they are. And then they walk out, and another hotshot guy comes in and tells you how great he is, and walks out. He said, when we sat down with you, you summarized your background in 15 seconds, and then you said, how can I help you? He said, that's what we were waiting to hear. So I had this meeting with Macquarie at my office, and they gave me the go-ahead to do this, and I wrote this memorandum of law, which I'm like to boast a little bit, has something of a legendary quality today, this particular memorandum. I submitted it to the banking department. I got a letter back. The first sentence of the letter was, based upon your thorough and well-reasoned analysis, we agree with your conclusion. And basically my conclusion was this. A representative office can't do any banking, it can't do any business, it can't approve anything, it can't do anything. All it can do is solicit business. And let's say the client wants to make a loan, the representative office can put together the loan file, but then they send it off to Germany or Japan or England or wherever, and it gets approved or disapproved, and the loan is made there. So all the representative office does is look for clients and introduce the loan. That works fine with loans, because loans can take weeks to be approved. It doesn't work with real-time trades in commodity derivatives. You have to have an answer right now. Well, you couldn't do that with an old representative office, but you can do it with something called the internet. And I said to myself, why can't you have a representative in New York who talks to a client, and the client says, I want to do such and such derivative trade, and he gets on the phone with his counterpart in Sydney, or we have a big branch in London, actually, that does a lot of the trading. I reasoned all this through. I explained it all in the memorandum. I went through every provision of law that was relevant and showed why it not only was not adverse to what we were saying, but what we were saying really fit within what the law was intending. It's just no one knew about the internet then. So they came back and said, yes, we agree. The business could only lend as much money as it had, but if you make it into a representative office, it can use the bank's balance sheet and make much bigger loans. I opened a couple of standard representative offices, and finally I get a phone call from my friend in New York at the Fed, and this very portentous voice. He says, we want to meet with you and your client in Washington. Oh my God, this is going to Washington. This is serious now, This is really, wow. So we came in and we met with the Fed. I think they're going to say yes. But I think because what we're doing is so new, they want to talk to you. They want to look you in the eye. They want to say, do you understand what you're doing? No one had ever thought of this. This was my creation. This is why I fit with Macquarie. We think outside the box. And so we go into this. Of course, I'd been at the Fed many times, both when I worked there and later in law practice. And so they try to intimidate you. And they have people on the phone from New York and people on the phone from Texas. And I'm surrounded by the head of supervision, the head of the legal side of supervision, the head of foreign bank supervision. I know all these people. I've dealt with them. And the head guy points his finger at me and says, I think this is maybe my favorite moment of my whole career. He points his finger at me and he says, you and your client have made us rethink what a representative office is. Okay. And then he said, seriously, Dave, we've tried to punch holes in this, and it seems to hang together. He says, but it only hangs together if you understand the limitations of a representative office, and if you build a very strong compliance structure around it. And I said to him, and this is true, I said, you guys know me. I've represented foreign banks. I've opened branches. I've opened rep offices. I know the difference. My client knows the difference. We're working on compliance manuals right now. We were. Stephen would draft something, send it to me, I'd mark it up, send it back. And so they nodded their heads, and they said, we're going to let you do this, but we're going to keep you on a short lease. Interesting story. It's called Cook Inlet Energy Supply. You know what Cook Inlet is? That's the waterway that leads up to Juneau, Alaska. The guy who founded it was an Inuit native. He had gone to UCLA Business School. Very bright guy. And he had discovered there are set-asides under the law for minority-owned energy businesses. And he went to Harvard's endowment fund and got them to fund him. And he opened this business, trading natural gas. And he had built it up, and it was quite successful. And it was a trading company. They didn't produce natural gas. They didn't, use it. It was a trading company. They brought together buyers and sellers and put on derivatives. So it was right up our alley. And I filed a notice with the Fed explaining all about this business. But I told the Fed we were going to use our representative office in Los Angeles to trade oil and gas derivatives, the same way we did in Houston and New York. And they never responded. And so all they needed was a notice. I gave them a notice. And we are the second largest trader in the United States in natural gas after ExxonMobil. Believe it or not. No one knows who we are. So these two representative offices that I helped create today employ, I think in New York it's about 35 people, and in Houston it's more like 45 or 50. We now have, I think, 700 billion under management. Gay people, we have women. My boss in Sydney is a woman. My immediate boss, our general counsel, is now a woman. And they sent this woman over from Sydney to run the compliance function. And so she and I were technically co-heads of compliance. We'll redefine my role, okay? Call me an advisor. Head of Risk Management Group Legal Affairs. Basically, David, do what you do. Don't worry about anything else. So my role became overseeing the representative office structure, dealing with the Fed, generally providing high-level advice on our business structure in the U.S. I was kind of the guru. People started calling me the professor. I was the go-to guy for everything in New York. David, if you're thinking of leaving Clifford Chance, why don't you just come work for Macquarie? Wow, okay. He said, how about head of compliance for the U.S., for the Americas? And I said, well, I'm not a compliance guy. I'm a lawyer. He said, oh, don't worry about it. We have someone who runs compliance. We want you to supervise her and her staff, and you take the high-level approach, and she does the actual compliance work. They have said to me repeatedly, as long as I want to keep working, they want me on board. I see it even with the New York State Bar Association, which I've been involved with my entire career, really. The membership is declining steadily. And young people especially just don't perceive the value and the importance of things like, I ran the banking law committee for 3 year stints. I was chair of the banking law committee. And just getting a group of banking lawyers together, 3 or 4 times a year, and talking through issues and going over what's important, what's happening, what isn't happening, what do we need to focus on. You can't replicate that, just with online stuff. When I was growing up, I told you a lot about my sister. My sister was, quite a handful. She had problems. I'm not criticizing her. She was a very difficult person to deal with. She was very temperamental. She was very demanding in her way. She was more like my father than like my mother in that respect. But she took a lot of the oxygen out of the room. My parents, and I was kind of expected to be the good son, not to make. I wasn't. I never was a troublesome kid. I wasn't the kind of kid who went out and got into trouble. But it just, I kind of internalized. My job is to kind of be a peacemaker, kind of be not taking up all the energy in the room, kind of be the one who, I would moderate between my father and my mother. They would argue. The main thing they argued about was Wendy and her issues. So I think I kind of internalized, number one, that I had to pretty much take care of myself and not make a problem for other people. But number two, that it's funny, I focused more on what I thought were my deficiencies then. I saw myself as I said, my self-image was, I was this fat little kid, and I got teased for being fat all the time. And so, I'm not going to be one of these social types who goes out with girls and does all that kind of stuff. I'm going to be this smart kid who's just going to be smarter than everybody else. And I'm just going to work at that. And there were things in which I knew I excelled. And writing was the number one thing I knew I did best. Because I was getting so much feedback from my teachers that, you really know how to write, you're really a good writer. Your answer is you find people who are supportive. I think of my piano teacher, Lori Walfish, who I mentioned. She was someone who always was focused on you. What will help me to develop most as a pianist? What will give me the greatest joy as a pianist? I'll never forget, she assigned me a Beethoven sonata. And strangely enough, as much as I love Beethoven, this particular sonata did not appeal to me. It never got into my blood. I never felt love for it. And there was a Mozart sonata I wanted to play. And I said, Mrs. Walfish, I'd rather do the Mozart. And she said, I know, David, but I think the Beethoven will be better for you. You will learn more from it. Okay, try the Beethoven. So I worked on the Beethoven. I worked on it a couple of weeks, pretty hard. And we're in the middle of a lesson, and she says to me, your heart is not in this piece, David, is it? And I said, Mrs. Walfish, it really isn't. I love Beethoven, but this piece, fine, we will do the Mozart. And she closed the book and put it away and opened the Mozart. To me, that's the paradigm. Too many teachers, I think, they're like lawyers, like anyone else. It's my way or the highway. The one thing I want to add is how extraordinary, and I mean this, our Amherst connection is. I never dreamed, because of the bitter experience I had at Amherst, and I stuck it out despite the injury to my hand and everything else. And senior year was my best year socially because of Theta Xi. I was finally among the people I wanted to be with, and I had a wonderful experience there. But I didn't have much connection with Amherst until our 20th reunion. And they were looking for someone to be the class secretary. And my friend Jonathan Reese was there, and he said, Dave, you write so well, why don't you do it? Can I put your name in? I said, okay. And I wound up as the class secretary. And the rest, as they say, is history. I went from class secretary to editing the 25th reunion book to becoming class president in the 90s. And I've always been involved with all of the reunion stuff and the reunion committees. My Beatles program started because we had a conference call early in 2013 looking to our 45th. And the reunion planning committee, what kind of programs can we put on? And I said, I've always wanted to do a program about the music of the Beatles because I hear connections between their music and classical music. And I want to talk about that. Okay, fine, we can do it. That's how it started. To me, that's the amazing thing about Amherst. Amherst has given me so many opportunities to express myself in different ways. The different courses I've taken, the WAMF, which by my senior year I was practically running the station. I was doing news, I was doing sports, I did play-by-play football, I did classical music, I did whatever I wanted. It was basically my toy to play with. The Amherst Student, I wrote music criticism for. I wrote articles for. And, you know, I found myself, like, I had never thought about acting. I found myself in a little theater group acting. Oh, so when they told me this, they said, you know, you have to come with us so you can at least read for the part and we can make sure you can at least act, you know. And I looked at this guy's big speech where he blows up about these people. You can't believe a word they say, and so forth and so on. And I summoned up all my inner bigotry, and I knocked it dead. And Drew was smiling. He nodded his head. He said, "Don't worry about it. You can act." So the other guy, Paul, said to Drew, "No, that's not acting. He's just being himself." I did some amateur theater thereafter. So again, I mean, Amherst just introduced me to these things. And when opportunities come to you, you know, it's not the opportunity, it's what you make of it. And that's true of any of us, I think. And all of these things that I did helped to make me, it gave me self-confidence. You know, I did lots of lectures before the Bar Association. I taught law school for 25 years as an adjunct professor. I created the course in banking law, and I taught it. And I was always completely comfortable on my feet up in front of an audience. I never had stage fright whatsoever, except one thing, playing the piano. I always panicked when I was playing the piano for people. You know, what if I forget? You know, what if my hand stopped in the middle? I wrote about Mahler's Third. The opening theme of Mahler's Third in a minor key is da dum bum bum bum.